He wrote over 200 songs, and he has been called a singing psychologist for children. And for 30 years, you may remember that he would step onto a porch, open the door with a beaming smile, change his suit jacket to a zippered cardigan sweater, put on his boat shoes, and start to sing, "Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor?" Some people thought that he was a bit corny. How could any neighborhood be full of nice people who care about you and take care of you? Because life is rough. You have to be rough to survive and to prosper. That was not the message of Mr. Rogers, whose gentleness and concern allayed children's fear in the midst of Vietnam and Watergate, Chernobyl, in the midst of the Ethiopian famine, Oklahoma City, John Benet Ramsey. His neighborhood provided peace and calm, familiarity and safety. Troubling feelings and fears were gently explored, and reassurance was given to millions of children. He was considered a nerd and a target for ridicule. If you ever watched Saturday Night Live, you might remember the parody that was done with Eddie Murphy starring in Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. But this gentleman took it all in stride. He never changed his approach, his demeanor, or even his sweater. He talked to children about God and death and spirituality. And in his own quiet way, he was an advocate of faith and values, and he gave children an experience of the goodness and the sacredness of life. In 1998, they gave him a Life Achievement Award, an Emmy. And when he stood up to speak, he spoke after Drew Carey, who spoke with some very objectionable language. And Rogers looked out at that celebrity audience, and he said this. He said, "All of us have special ones who have loved us into being. Would you just take, along with me, 10 seconds to think of the people who have helped you become who you are? 10 seconds of silence. I'll watch the time." He said that to an auditorium filled with Hollywood celebrities. To some, he was a nerd. To millions, he was a blessing. Deuteronomy this weekend presents us with a choice. We can choose to bless the world, or we can choose to curse the world. Mr. Rogers chose to bless the world, and we are all better for it. One of the great screenwriters of the last 50 years is Woody Allen. And yet, as humorous and bright as he is, he doesn't really bless the world. One might say that he curses the world. His philosophy of life is one that's taken from the philosophy of Camus and Sartre, the existentialist philosophy where there is no meaning, there is no purpose in life, and he is very cynical. He began his career writing comedy, and there are collections of his works, and one is entitled Getting Even, that portrays his cynicism. There's a nephew talking to his uncle, and he says to his uncle, "Could it not be simply that we are alone and aimless, doomed to wander in an indifferent universe with no hope of salvation, nor any prospect except misery, death, and the empty reality of eternal nothing?" And the uncle looks down at his nephew and says to him, "And you wonder why you're not invited to more parties?" Allen is bright and funny, but sad. Life makes no sense. He's written these words: "Life is divided into the horrible and the miserable. Life is full of misery, loneliness, and suffering, and it's all over much too soon. Most of the time, I don't have much fun. The rest of the time, I don't have any fun at all. Not only is there no God, but try getting a plumber on weekends. Funny but sad. There's a great line from the movie Thelma and Louise where Susan Sarandon says to Gina Davis, who is telling her how she has learned to accept her unhappy and frustrating life, she says to her, "Well, you get what you settle for." Mr. Rogers settled for goodness. Ellen didn't, or doesn't. Tim Madigan is a journalist with the Fort Worth Star newspaper, and a number of years ago he was given the assignment to interview Fred Rogers, and he became one of his closest friends. And he wrote a book about their friendship entitled "I'm Proud of You." And it was this book that really overwhelmed me with the goodness of this man, Fred Rogers, a man without guile, a man who gave many blessings to the world. The book is very similar to Tuesdays with Morrie, and Tim Madigan shares with us how Fred Rogers actually saved his marriage and changed his life forever. Madigan tells us that the words he spoke were healing words. They were filled with life as good and sacred. I found it to be a really good read. So we have a choice, all of us as humans, and Deuteronomy points that out. We can bless or we can curse. Fred Rogers chose to bless the world with kindness and truly gave us an experience of God. Woody Allen chooses, with his humor, to what some might say, curse the world for its meaninglessness and absurdity. Fred Rogers chose to enter into the depths of life and have an experience of God beyond the intellectual concepts that we have created. Woody Allen is aware only of a God of human concepts, thus staying on the surface of life and denying that God of the intellect, who he feels sits in the sky and decides who will be happy and who won't. Unfortunately, many in our world today choose to stay on the surface of life and only believe in a God in the sky who makes some happy and others very unhappy. And thus they no longer choose to believe in the God of human concepts. But they're never able to move beyond their grammar school religious education to have an experience of the eternal, the holy, the sacred in all things, in the joys and sadnesses of life, in the successes and failures, in the highs and lows. And thus, so many people do end up cursing life because their foundation, as the gospel says, is one of sand. Fred Rogers gives us an example of someone who has experienced the transcendent. His foundation is built on rock, and that's the reason he's able to bless the world in spite of all of the difficulties that he experienced as a human being. So where are we? What is the choice that we make? Do we curse life because of the tragedies and heartaches of our lives? Or do we bless life because we have had an experience of God and discovered the holy and the sacred in all things? Maybe a question we can all ask ourselves is, what am I settling for in this life? And perhaps I can end with a paraphrase of the very short little talk that Fred Rogers gave the night he accepted his Emmy. All of us have experienced hardships and difficulties in our lives, but we have also experienced many blessings. Let us take 10 seconds to think of the blessings that this life has given to us. 10 seconds of silence to be aware of the holy and the sacred in all things.